How would you like it if we started sending official delegations to Honolulu to meet with separatist leaders who want Hawaiian independence from the United States? What would you do if we started selling them weapons? It might seem like a false equivalence, but this is a line of argument often deployed by China's legion of armchair warriors, who take to social media to condemn any visit to Taiwan by U.S. government officials, and especially members of the U.S. Congress. China sees self-ruled Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually be under Beijing's control, and so, to these social media users, such visits are an unacceptable provocation and interference in China's internal affairs. Of course, these visits, like the one being made by Representative Mike Gallagher, head of the U.S. House's China Committee, this week, are viewed very differently in Washington and Taipei, which sees itself as distinct from the Chinese mainland, with its own constitution and democratically elected leaders. But it does raise the question, what is their purpose? Are they a genuine show of support that helps deter China, or are they publicity stunts that serve to provoke Beijing and solidify the view that Washington is intent on the permanent separation of Taiwan? Short presentational gray line. The visits are not without consequence. How the U.S. handles its relationships with Beijing and Taipei will do much to determine whether the current tense stalemate across the Taiwan Straits remains that way or gets a lot worse. We have come here to reaffirm U.S. support for Taiwan and express solidarity in our shared commitment to democratic values, said Congressmen Ami Bera and Mario Diaz-Balart as they wound up a trip here in January. They were the first to make the pilgrimage to Taipei following the January 13th presidential election. Now, the hawkish Rep. Gallagher, who told The Guardian last year Beijing was aiming to render us subordinate, humiliated, and irrelevant on the world stage, arrives with a number of colleagues a month later. It is likely they will not be the last. Since 2016, the number of U.S. congressional delegations crossing the Pacific has increased dramatically. In 2018, for example, 6 lawmakers made the trip. Last year, 32 visited, according to a tally by Global Taiwan. A handout photo made available by the Taiwan Presidential Office shows Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen, C, posing for a picture with U.S. Representative Ami Bera, R, and U.S. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, L, during their meeting in Taipei, Taiwan, January 25, 2024. Image source, EPA. Image caption. President Tsai Ing-wen met U.S. Representatives Ami Bera, right, and Mario Diaz-Balart in January. That trend has been actively encouraged by Taiwan's current president Tsai Ing-wen and does not appear to have been discouraged on the U.S. side. Indeed, President Joe Biden has been the most explicit of any U.S. leader yet in his defense of Taiwan, albeit while still continuing a commitment to America's One China policy. What is the One China policy? It's important, says J. Michael Cole, a former Canadian intelligence officer and one-time advisor to President Tsai. The United States keeps saying we have a rock-solid commitment to Taiwan. But you need a public component to that exercise. That's what rattles Beijing. That's what gets journalists writing about it. And unlike the $80 million, £63 million grant signed off by Biden in November, these visits also represent a low-cost way for the U.S. to reassure the people of Taiwan that they do mean what they say. We have research that shows high-level visits increase people's confidence in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, says Chunfeng Yu, a political scientist at Soochow University in Taipei. Such visits promote a more friendly attitude towards America from those who remain skeptical of whether the U.S. would actually turn up if Taiwan were attacked by China, he explains. However, there are others here who have imbibed conspiracy theories, many of which originate from across the Taiwan Strait, that America is pushing Taipei down the road to war with China, just as conspiracy theorists say it did with Ukraine's war with Russia. Meanwhile, American congressmen and women have their own, not always selfless, reasons for coming here. The pilgrimage to Taipei is increasingly a way for those on the right to burnish their anti-China credentials to voters back home, although these days, the left appears just as keen to prove their own tough stances when it comes to Beijing. Media caption. Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, democracy a source of strength. The increased frequency and unabashed publicity shows how much has changed between Washington and Beijing. Before 2016, people thought visits here should be low-key, says Chen Fengyu. They wanted to avoid angering China. But now more and more people realize that no matter what they do, they will anger China. Taiwan just chose a president China loathes. What now? The Taiwan that China wants is vanishing. The Paradise Islands caught in the US-China crosshairs. Taiwan's relationship with the US Congress is deep and long. When in 1979, President Jimmy Carter broke relations with Taipei and recognized Beijing, it was the US Congress that forced him to sign the Taiwan Relations Act. That act is what underpins the relationship with Taipei to this day. It explicitly commits the US to opposing any attempt to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait by force, and to supplying Taiwan with sufficient weaponry to defend itself against China. In the 1970s, Taiwan was a military dictatorship. Its US allies were Republican. The Cold War was still very chilly, and the islands were seen as a bulwark against communism. Today, anti-communism may still play a small part. But far more important is solidarity with a fellow democracy. Taiwan is no longer a Republican Party cause. In the wake of things like Trump's trade wars, arguments over COVID's origins, and spy balloons being spotted in the US, support for Taiwan among Americans now spreads through both parties. Added to this, the US also has major national security and economic interests tied to Taiwan, in particular, the semiconductor trade. It all means that, unlike with Ukraine, there are no voices in Congress calling for the US to cut military support for Taiwan. If anything, it is the opposite.